James Holloway had lived on Maple Street for over 50 years. The old house, with its weathered blue shutters and sprawling oak tree in the front yard, had once been filled with laughter, the smell of home-cooked meals, and the steady hum of life. But now, it stood in quiet solitude, much like James himself. At 78 years old, James was a man of routine. Each morning, he would brew a pot of coffee, sit by the bay window, and watch the world pass by. The young families rushing their kids to school, the joggers taking their morning runs, the newspaper boy tossing the day's edition onto porch as life moved on. But James felt like a relic of the past. His wife, Eleanor, had passed away a decade ago, leaving a void that time had refused to fill. His son, Mark, had built his life on the other side of the country, too busy with work and family to visit often. James understood life was demanding, but understanding didn't make the loneliness any easier. One evening, as he sat on the porch with his old rocking chair creaking beneath him, he found himself flipping through a photo album. Yellowed photographs of summer vacations, Christmas mornings, and birthdays long gone stared back at him. His fingers traced the faces of his younger self, Eleanor, and Mark as a child. A deep sigh escaped his lips. What had happened to time? Just as he was about to close the album, a knock at the door startled him. James wasn't expecting anyone. Visitors were rare these days. When he opened the door, a young woman with auburn hair and bright green eyes stood there, clutching a small bag. "Mr. Holloway?" she asked hesitantly. James frowned slightly. "Yes?" She smiled warmly. "I'm Claire Bennett. I just moved in next door. I was baking cookies and thought I'd bring some over." James blinked, caught off guard. "That's very kind of you." Claire held out the tin of cookies. "I hope you like chocolate chip." He hesitated for a moment before taking them. "Thank you, Miss Bennett. Please call me Claire." She glanced around. "You have a beautiful home." James looked at the house, its paint peeling in places, the wooden porch needing repair. "It's old," he said simply. "That's what makes it charming," Claire replied with a grin. James wasn't sure what to make of his new neighbor. She was young, likely in her 30s, full of energy that felt foreign to his quiet world. But there was something genuine about her kindness, and for the first time in a long while, James didn't feel invisible. Over the next few weeks, Claire's presence became a familiar part of James's routine. At first, her visits were brief, a casual wave from her porch, a quick hello while she watered her plants. But soon, she started stopping by more often, bringing freshly baked bread or homemade soup. James, initially wary of her intentions, found himself looking forward to their conversations. Claire had a way of making the silence feel less heavy. She would sit with him on the porch, sipping tea and sharing stories about her life. "I grew up in Chicago," she told him one evening. "Loud, busy, always moving. I loved it, but I wanted something quieter. So here I am." James nodded. "Maple Street's plenty quiet, all right." She smiled. "And what about you? Have you always lived here?" He exhaled deeply. "Eleanor and I bought this house after we got married. Raised our boy here. Mark's in California now, doing well for himself." Claire hesitated. "Do you see him often?" James's eyes darkened slightly. "Not as much as I'd like. He calls, but life keeps him busy." Claire could hear the sadness in his voice. "I'm sure he loves you." James forced a small smile. "Love changes when life moves forward." Claire didn't push further. Instead, She changed the subject, telling him about the bookstore she planned to open downtown. James found himself genuinely interested. "You think people still buy books?" he asked. "Some do," she replied. "But I want it to be more than a bookstore. A place for people to gather, share stories, maybe even hold a reading club for senior citizens." James scoffed lightly. "You trying to get me to join?" Claire grinned. "Would you?" He didn't answer, but for the first time in a long while, he thought about stepping beyond the walls of his home. As the days passed, Claire became more than just a neighbor. She became a friend. She convinced James to take short walks with her, pointing out things he had long stopped noticing: the way the leaves turned golden in the fall, the warmth of the sun on his face, the laughter of children playing down the street. One afternoon, as they walked through the park, Claire stopped suddenly. "What's wrong?" James asked. She pointed toward a wooden bench. "That man's been sitting there for hours." James followed her gaze. A frail, elderly man sat alone, staring blankly at the pond. His clothes were neat but slightly worn, and his hands trembled as he held a small photograph. "I'll be right back," Claire said, before walking toward him. James watched as she sat beside the stranger, speaking softly. The man turned to her, and after a moment, his face relaxed. When she returned, James raised an eyebrow. "You make a habit of talking to strangers?" She shrugged. "He just lost his wife. He doesn't have anyone to talk to." James looked back at the man, something tightening in his chest. "I told him he should join us for coffee tomorrow," Claire added. James chuckled. "You don't take no for an answer, do you?" "Nope." And just like that, James's world, once small and quiet, began to expand. One cold evening, as James sat by the fire reading a book Claire had recommended, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen and hesitated. "Mark?" It had been weeks since their last conversation. Sighing, he answered. "Hello, son." "Hey, Dad." Mark's voice came through, sounding hurried. "Have you been? Still breathing?" James said dryly. Mark chuckled. "That's good to hear." There was a pause. Then Mark added, "Listen, I know I haven't called much. Work's been—" "I know," James interrupted. "You're busy." Mark hesitated. "I'll try to visit soon." James wasn't sure if he believed that. He had heard it before. Instead of arguing, he simply said, "I'd like that." After they hung up, James sat in silence. He wanted to tell Mark about Claire, about the new people in his life, about the bookstore opening next month. But the distance between them wasn't just miles, it was years of growing apart. And James didn't know how to bridge that gap. It happened on a brisk November afternoon. James had gone out for his usual walk alone, while Claire was busy at her bookstore. As he crossed the street near his house, his foot caught on the uneven pavement. The world tilted. Pain shot through his side as he hit the ground hard. His head spun. For a moment, he lay there, trying to catch his breath. People passed by, some sparing a glance, but no one stopped. Until "Mr. Holloway," Claire's voice. Then hands, warm and steady, lifting him gently. "Can you sit up?" she asked, her voice thick with concern. James gritted his teeth, nodding. "Just give me a minute." Claire sat beside him on the cold pavement. "You scared me," she admitted. James let out a weak chuckle. "Guess I'm not as sturdy as I used to be. You need a doctor." "I'll be fine." She gave him a look. "I'm taking you to the hospital." For once, James didn't argue. James spent a few days recovering. Claire visited daily, bringing books and talking about the bookstore, distracting him from the dull ache in his ribs. One evening, as she helped him sort through his mail, she paused. "You have a letter." James frowned. "Who from?" She handed it to him. The return address read, Mark Holloway. James's hands trembled slightly as he opened the envelope. "Dad, I know I haven't been the best son. I let time and distance get in the way. When Claire called me about your fall, I realized how much I've taken for granted. I'm sorry. I booked a flight. I'll be there next week. I hope it's not too late to make things right. Love." Mark James stared at the words, his vision blurring. Claire touched his arm. "Are you okay?" He swallowed the lump in his throat. "Yeah." And for the first time in a long while, James felt hope. A week later, as he stood on his porch, watching a taxi pull up, he saw Mark step out, looking older, but still his boy. Their eyes met, and without hesitation, Mark walked up and hugged him tight. James closed his eyes, holding onto the son he thought he had lost, and just like that, the echoes of yesterday faded, making room for a new beginning.